Okay, welcome. We are happy to be here for our next in the series of CCYP's Shaping the Cape video podcast. I'm Lauren Barker. I'm the CEO of CCYP. I'm joined by some awesome special guests today who are going to speak with us about advocacy and civic engagement and the importance of advocating for ourselves as young people living and working on the Cape. So before I turn it over to them to introduce themselves, I just want to thank our sponsor for this series. We have a three-part public policy series. It's an update on the three big policy areas that CCYP focuses on. The first one we did was on childcare. This one obviously on civic engagement, and our next one will be on housing. So thank you so much to the Cape and Islands Association of Realtors for their support in making this possible. And I now want to welcome our guests. So let's go down the line and you can introduce yourselves. I'll start with Tamora. Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Tamora Israel. I'm a poet, performer, actor, activist, former self-apologizer. Yeah, I think it's important for us to speak our minds, not just as people on Cape, but people in the world, and hopefully that will create a ripple effect throughout our relationships and hopefully reach others in a kind and loving way.
Awesome. And Tamora, we connected, we were chatting before this around your involvement and really just speaking at one of the local marches here on the Cape for racial equality in Orleans.
Yes.
So you've been involved in that effort as well. Awesome.
Yeah, I just always have something to say.
I think that's great. Well, let's move on to Stephanie Cox, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Stephanie Cox. I own my own activism training and lobbying training company, Nexus Works, and am a longtime political insider, if you will. So I kind of approach my trainings from that perspective of knowing what works for people who are on the inside who are making a lot of the policies and trying to make what can seem overwhelming and complicated actually really simplified, and with the goal of getting more people involved and not just leaving all the decisions to sort of, the insiders and the lobbyists, but actually helping to bridge that divide between the general public and decision makers. And former longtime CCYP board member, Shape the Cape, author of that report we did, co-author, and civic engagement committee that has been named many different things over the years. I used to chair that as well, and excited to be here.
Awesome. And Stephanie, you have a lot of experience with housing advocacy, which is one of the perspectives that you'll drop in our discussion. And last but not least, I want to turn it over to Noelle Pina.
Hi, I'm Noelle Pina. I'm the Executive Director at the Orleans Chamber of Commerce, and I've been in that role now for a little over 7 years. But my work at the Chamber, but also my husband's from the Cape, so I was living I'm from Nassau, Bahamas. I was living there in 2007 when I saw that CCYP had been formed, so I paid attention to the organization because when I moved here in 2010, I knew I would want to make more connections with people who were like me, young business people, business-minded, work-focused people on the Cape. So I used CCYP for that, but then my main involvement now with the group is through the Public Policy Committee. So I shifted over time from going to the happy hours to going to the public policy meetings, and I've really learned a lot. So that's what I'll be talking about here today, is my experience with the Public Policy Committee and how it's led to help me learn about issues on the Cape, and also just keep my general interest going in what's happening in the area and how to move things forward. That's something that I did in Nassau. It's a small community, just like here. So once you get to know who's in charge, you can connect with them and then pass along stories to them. And it does help make meaningful change come about.
Yeah, and in terms of meaningful change, I mean, we've got a pretty phenomenal panel here for our discussion today. Some three movers and shakers, really, when it comes to advocacy and civic engagement. The three of you are such great examples of that. And so I'm excited to chat because I think that a lot of times what we find is an intimidation factor where people feel, especially younger people, like they don't have the experience or you know, the platform to stand up and speak from their own experiences and talk about what they need in order to be successful and be supported in our community. And that's one of the big focus areas of CCYP, is to empower young people to feel more comfortable taking on that role. So I think that the three of you will have a lot to contribute on that subject. So advocating for ourselves is the topic, and we're going to be talking about, you know, how each of you have kind of used your own experiences and knowledge and, you know, gumption, really. I think just the ability to kind of put yourself out there and talk about what you observe and what you see the needs to be, and the importance of those individual actions that we can all be taking. I'm hoping that by the end of the conversation, we'll have some things that we can share with people in terms of some attainable goals that they can have to start taking those next steps. So how did you personally get into advocacy work? That's one of the big questions that I had, because I'm not sure that I know the story for each of you, and whether it's civic engagement in some form, volunteerism, or straight advocacy. You know, I think that can take a lot of forms. So why don't we start with Tamora? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, my dog was moving around. I was just like, I don't want to interrupt anyone. I guess I got into advocacy years ago at 4Cs. While I was there, I love 4Cs, by the way. It's a wonderful college. While I was there, I noticed that there wasn't a club for people of color. So I wanted to start my own. So I went to the events coordinator, Kathy Andrews, who has since become my mentor and kind of like my second mother. She's an amazing woman. I went to her and I was like, hey, let's start this thing. And she's like, well, you need like 200 signatures to start a club. And I was like, bet, be right back. So I did that. And like, since then, like we started the Unity Club, and then I became a part of the Rotaract Club. And then after graduating, I became a part of the Rotary Club, the Barnstable Sunrise Rotary Club, which meets at 7 a.m., but that's all right, because justice knows no time. So I guess it started at 4Cs, and since then I've just been, it's been more than important. It's been a lifeline to just not just advocate for myself as a Black woman, but advocate for people on Cape who are food insecure, people who live in crappy situations, people who are in, you know, abusive relationships, or, you know, LGBTQ plus people, like just using my voice to help those who need a little bit of help. Like, yeah, that's where it started for me at 4Cs.
Yeah, I mean, I love the trajectory, because it starts with just seeing a need that isn't fulfilled, going, I'm going to do that. And it reminds me of, you know, the quote of, I kept thinking that someone else would solve the problem, and then I realized I was someone else. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's, I mean, I feel like that's kind of the heart of advocacy, is using whatever means you have at your disposal to make positive change people around you. So that's awesome. How about you, Stephanie? How'd you get into this?
I'm the weirdo who's been, you know, interested in politics since I was probably even before I was a teenager. So I too went to 4Cs and then UMass Boston. But for me, I just, you know, I wanted to dig in and actually work in this field. And I recognize that is, you know, not everyone is like that. But for me, the motivation, so I worked for various elected officials, you know, at the State House, for a member of Congress, managed a bunch of campaigns. But, you know, for me, the motivation was basically just like seeing a lot of injustices. I remember, you know, when I was an intern at the State House, my first time walking out of Park Street T Station and walking up to the State House and seeing homeless people sleeping on the benches, 500 yards from the State House, and being like, there's a disconnect here. What, like, how does this, how does this exist at the same time? And here locally, I mean, the Cape is my home, and I feel very passionately about it being attainable to everyone who, whether you grew up here or you're working here, you want to make a life here, that it not just become, the playground of, the super wealthy, that there are, there's access and opportunities for everybody. And for me, that manifests in the form of better housing policies that don't exclude people through exclusionary zoning. So that's a lot of the local advocacy that I tend to do. So that's my motivation.
Awesome. You definitely saw, I mean, again, it's kind of that moment of realizing, looking around, who's going to do something? Like, this is wrong. This is not going the way it should be going. And then using your voice to stand up and try to make that better. It's awesome. How about you, Noel?
So I don't know if I've ever went into this with you before, Lauren, in all of our public policy stuff. Politics is way of life in the Bahamas. It's a two-party system, and everybody wears either yellow or red at election time. You know who your magistrate is. It's running for your area personally in many instances. And because it's such a small community, I went to school with friends of mine whose parents had served or grandparents had served in government. Some even were the governor general, or they were my grand aunt's good friend was the deputy prime minister for the Bahamas. So you just have this insight, this connection directly to people who are making decisions. Now, the other part of growing up in a smaller country like that is they don't have the same type of, there's no open meeting. I mean, there is kind of, but it's not the same level as here. So, for example, I was shocked when I moved to Mashpee and I got in the mail the budget for the town and could read through and see everything that was happening in my own town. So I came from a place where the access to the information was not easy. It still isn't to this day. It's getting better, but it's nowhere near what we have here. And so I moved to the Cape in 2010 with that perspective, and then I went to work at the New Bedford, now it's the South Coast Chamber of Commerce, and that is a large regional chamber similar to the size of the Cape Cod Chamber, and similar type of work where it's very policy focused. So we had these government affairs meetings once a month, and it would be the state reps and the state senator and different people were invited to come in and talk on different topics. I will never forget when the superintendent of schools came to talk. So I had access to see that behind the scenes work of how the chamber was able to make their legislative agenda and then move things forward by having direct contact to the people at the Beacon Hill that are making the decisions. Then when I moved to working at the Orleans Chamber of Commerce, now the connections are now on a town level. So, I make sure that I know the selectmen, they know me. I've been in to speak with our finance committee. I know people on other committees in Orleans, but then also I live in Mashpee. So I've taken the time to, I know who the selectmen are. I read who is making what decisions in the newspaper every week. And so it just became, it's something that I've always done. But now I find it even more interesting because I have way more information available to me to keep in touch, to keep on top of what's happening, so that when I feel like I need to have something, when I have something to say, I can say it.
Couldn't find my cursor there for a second. That's great. I think I mean, that's so interesting to hear, because I think we do take that for granted, that everything is as transparent as it is. And yet somehow we still feel like we don't have enough information to speak with confidence on certain things. And so overcoming that and realizing how much information we actually do have access to, that's a really neat perspective to take.
Well, and actually, I'll just say that there have been numerous studies that have been done showing that women in particular, we tend to feel that we need to know everything about everything before we say anything. That's you know, one of the things that I think is important when speaking up is, you know, it's important to do sort of some basic cursory, you know, education, to read the paper or whatnot, but you don't need to be an expert in order to engage in the dialogue. And I think that that is the beauty of our system, is that the founding fathers very much intended for there to be, you know, public participation.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say I love that point, Steph, because it you know, it almost is a better thing when you aren't an expert, because you have a fresh set of eyes. And so I think that is a great thing about, you know, this democratic process, is to be able to speak from your experience as well, instead of from a place of technical expertise. You don't always have to be this expert in everything. You can speak about how the policies are impacting you, how that feels to you. And that's just as valid and as equally important, if not more so, because it's how do you live with it day to day.
Can I say, I think it's more important. So just from like thinking about the work that we try to do with the Public Policy Committee for CCYP, a lot of it over the last few years have been just to simply gather testimonials and gather information and experiences from people on how lack of childcare and lack of housing has affected them on the Cape. And then same thing with my work at the Chamber, when we are trying to shift some things on, you know, business policies that are being considered up at Beacon Hill. Our partners that are up there, the lobbyists, they're always asking for our smallest chambers to try to gather experiences from people. And it doesn't have to be perfect. They will pull out whatever quotes that they need and they can use. But what is most important is just having the experience spoken about at public hearings, during public comment, you know, in letters to the editor, on the phone, pick up the phone, call your state rep's office, call your senator's office, email them, and just share your experience, no matter what it may be, and how this is impacting you.
You want to add something, Tamara?
No, I agree with all of that. Like, I think it's really important to not just be able to speak on a topic, but know when something's coming up, you know when your town meeting is. And also like have that information, have the town put that information in a place where people will find it. You know, for people who don't regularly visit the town meeting like website, a lot of people don't. If you don't visit that, you don't know about it. So put it in places where people will learn from it. So I think that's something else that like the town could do to reach out a little bit more and have people be more involved. Like put that information where we can find it.
Yeah, and in a normal year, I mean, getting up and speaking at town meeting is one of the best ways that you can, you know, and most local actions that you can take to say, you know, hey, the town's thinking about doing this, that, or the other, and this is how it's going to affect me. I'm speaking from my personal experience, to get up at that microphone and take your couple minutes. I love that you brought up the access to information, because it's one of the things that we try to do. It's actually really timely. This week was a huge week for town elections and town meetings on Cape. We had many elections that took place on Tuesday, and then they're continuing through this week, as well as a couple of town meetings that moved ahead with modified, smaller agendas. And we try to compile all that information. And I completely agree with you, Tamara. It's not accessible. Even as someone that, you know, in a paid staff position, I'm spending time to research and compile this information. and it is still hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to search and dig, and for 15 or 14 towns, I guess, because Barnstable doesn't have town meeting, but for the elections, they take place at all different times. You know, we had ones that happened in March, and I blinked an eye and it was done. And so, you know, you just sort of, you really have to be tuned in. And if you're not, then you miss that opportunity. So we try to make that info accessible, but it is hard. So advocacy as a word kind of gets a bad rap, I feel like, and I wanted to spend some time chatting about that because you know, and Stephanie's laughing because we've definitely had this conversation. And it's hard to know where the line is, you know, to say when you're engaging in advocacy, when you've entered that kind of area where people feel uncomfortable. There's like a taboo element to it for some reason, and I'm not sure why that is. Did you have any misgivings yourselves when you started this work? Have you encountered other people who have, you know, what's kind of been your experience with that term advocacy? I'm gonna pick on Stephanie first because of your reaction when I brought this up.
Yeah, I always laugh when I do these trainings. Advocacy is not a legal term. Lobbying is a legal term. And education is also, you know, a legal term, but advocacy is this kind of weird gray area. But, you know, I would say this first and foremost, you know, I'm a lobbyist. I'm a lobbyist for better housing. You know, I'm a lobbyist for, you know, affordable housing, you know, programs at the state level, as well as locally. You can be, you know, there are professional, you know, lobbyist is basically someone who's paid to do this work. So I'm paid to do it. But I also do it, you know, as an individual advocate, and that's kind of where that line is. But, you know, there are lobbyists and there are advocates for, you know, the MSPCA, you know, and basically decisions are made by those who show up and those who participate. And so, you know, I think that lobbying and advocacy have gotten bad raps because the people who have been really heavily involved in the sort of middle of the decision-making process have been those with, you know, everyone has a special interest, but those who have sort of financial special interest and that tend to have the ability to, you know, hire a high-powered lobbyist and whatnot to get involved. For me, the solution is not to then everyone else disengage. The solution is for people to engage more, because the decisions are going to get made whether you're there or not. And so from my perspective is, you know, I remember my mother just being like, I don't understand why you're in politics. It's like, it's just such this, you know, nasty business or whatever. And I'm like, but Mom, if there's not people like me there, then who is making the decisions? Who's being involved? So advocacy, I look at as my, you know, my civic right, my civic duty. You know, as a woman of privilege, you know, like I have the ability to engage and not, you know, have some of the barriers that other people do. So I look at it as a responsibility as well. And it can be as simple as showing up at a public meeting, like a selectmen's meeting or something at the State House. But even just like your local town meeting or selectmen's meeting or planning board meeting and saying, here, this is my story. This is how the housing shortage on Cape Cod is affecting me and my ability to provide for my family. And this is how much I'm paying in rent. And there's so few people who engage, and the people who tend to engage all, you know, tend to be people more privileged. Like they tend to be older retirees. They tend to be white. They tend to be homeowners. And, you know, we're, you know, especially when you're working, you know, it is hard to find the time to engage. And so you know, I think one of the barriers too around advocacy is we feel like if we don't go all in, then it's not worth it. But that's not true. Even if you engage like once or twice a year, that is still like 100 or 200% more, you know, than you were doing before. And that can start to move the needle, because if you show up at a public meeting with 5 of your friends, like those are people those selectmen or planning board members have never seen before. They're used to seeing the same old people, and they think to themselves, geez, if there's these 5 people, who else is out there that we're not hearing from? And if they care about that, then maybe they care about that when they go to the ballot and vote.
I love it. I mean, I think it's such an important point. And I found this study recently. I need to share it with you, Stephanie, and all of you. It talks about who shows up at public meetings. And there was actually a really in-depth study done of public meeting records. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
The BU study, yeah.
Years in Boston, and they found, repeatedly that the people who were showing up were older white males, and that it influenced the type of decisions that were being made. So it's not just who's in the room, it actually sways the opinions and the decisions. I sit on the planning board in my town, and I can tell you that it is the same people who come to the meetings every month. And the people who we hear from and the experiences that we hear are the ones that we can factor into our decision making. But if we never hear those opinions, those perspectives, those voices, then we can't factor them in. And it's a problem, I think. And forget just showing up. We need more people on these boards and these committees. And it's something we talked about at CCYP for a long time. It's not, a situation where it should only be people who are retired or people who, have a ton of time to give, because it's, especially now, all the meetings are remote for the most part. So the barrier.
And the last thing I'll just say on that too is that study also showed, and this is also just intuitive, the people who show up for these things, particularly planning board meetings, zoning board of appeal meetings, they tend to be no. They tend to be there to say no, not in my backyard. It is a lot easier to kill something than it is to create something and build something. And so that's why it's sort of the challenge to create positive change for our communities is, it's a lot easier for people to say, I'm for affordable housing, but not here, rather than to say, yes, I want this in my backyard. Yes, I support this change. Yes, I have an idea. And that's the challenge that we face. But I think collectively, if we band together, I think that we really can. It's easier actually to shape an outcome when you do band together.
Yeah. What about you, Tamara, when it comes to advocacy? Did you have misgivings? I know you said in your intro, former self-apologizer. I mean, that right there tells me, there maybe was some thinking twice at the beginning. What are your thoughts?
Oh yeah, for sure. First, I just want to say, Stephanie, the whole time you were talking, like, I'm a poet, so I had to stop myself from just like snapping at everything you were saying. Like, yes, all of that. Yes.
You so can snap. Go ahead.
Yes. So much truth, man. Like, even if you just go to one meeting once a year, just go, bro. Please, God, go support your community in a way that makes you happy at night. You know what I'm saying? Like, I did something today. I could lay my head down. I did good today. It feels good. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be easy. Just go to these meetings. I'm sorry, I forgot your question. I got all so excited about what Stephanie said.
It's okay. Advocacy. What are your thoughts on? I mean, a lot of people have a bad taste in their mouth when it comes to just that word alone. They're going, okay, not me. Too political, too I'm out, count me out. So what do you
I think advocacy, I think it gets mixed up with lobbying, and I think that's on purpose. I think there are people at the top who want to keep things the way that they are. And if we make this word advocacy sound like this other word, lobbying, that sounds we don't really like that. Let's just put all of it to the side. It makes it easier for people to not go to these meetings. So I think this is done by design, but, and it's not a bad thing. Like Stephanie was saying, like, lobbying for better housing, that's a great thing. If that's what you want, go support those things and separate these two. I feel like advocacy is about support, like, I have your back. And like lobbying is more like influence, like, here's what you should do. So let's separate those things, not in a bad way, but just so we understand them better. And they can be useful for us, not just in our everyday lives, but in our kids' lives. Let's start thinking about tomorrow, because we're not going to live forever. But what the hell are we leaving for our kids today? What are we doing for not just our kids, our nieces, our mothers and stuff like that? Like, what are we leaving behind us to help the people who came before and after us? Because my mom is in her 60s. She's 60. She changes with the year. It took me a second. My mom is 60, but she can barely afford her medication. And that has to do with the laws in Georgia. You know, that has to do with the federal laws. So what am I doing, not just as her daughter here en masse, but as her daughter in the country? How am I helping her? You know, and I'd like to think about it like that. Like, instead of this huge, oh my God, this seems so big, I don't think we can handle this at once, I'd like to make it smaller. You know, this is what I'm doing, and I'm doing it for my mom. I'm doing it for my sister. I'm doing it for my dog. You know, I love my dog so very much. And, you know, just making those familiar connections of why we do these things. And advocacy, I think, is great. I think lobbying, and if it has an intention of helping, I think is great. I understand why there's a separation of the two words. Like I said before, it's done by design, but I really do think that if we just make it more personal, I think that's a way to get young people and just people in community involved more.
Yeah, and just picking that, I mean, I love that, just to pick the one, even if it's just one thing that you're really passionate about, or that really hits home for you, or that you've had, you know, personal experience with, and speak to that. Speak up about that. Or if you see, you know, a loved one that's going through something that you see a solution to, if things were to change on the policy level. No, I think that's awesome. What about you, Noelle?
I was just thinking, so this has been more my experience with working with chambers. So once a year, I used to go to Chamber of Commerce School. It's a training put on by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So, you know, big lobbying organization. And so we would go to Villanova, and I had 40 people in my class that were all paid staff for chambers and associations of all different sizes and types, working in, I mean, all sorts of different industries and areas from all over the country. And we would talk about politics a lot. And I said this to somebody last week, and he was like, oh, why would you talk about politics? And I'm like, well, we're not talking about D versus R, national level politics. Like, we're not talking about, you know, what we think about the president or the Secretary of State or, you know, the vice president. We're not talking about anything like that. It's all local level stuff. So it all has to do with local laws, whether it's things that are impacting your police department, fire department, zoning definitely is a big thing. Business policy, big thing. And so I think that people get so caught up in that if you're advocating for something, you have to think about on a national level. And that's fine if that's your interest. If you want to join, you know, your local town Republican committee or your local town Democratic committee and wave that flag proudly, more power to you. But that's not the only thing that you can, you know, put your stake in the sand for. If you see that your town, here's a good example, my mother-in-law sat on the Recreation Commission for the town of Barnstable for 20-something years because it was important to her. And recreation is so important. I live in Mashpee, where we have a great recreation department. There are multiple people that work there. They have a great aftercare program. They have a ton of different other programs for kids. It affects me because my son is 7 and he goes to the school. So what do I pay attention to? What's happening with recreation funding? What do they need? And, you know, I always tell them, I think they are doing a good job. I went and spoke at a select board meeting like a year ago in Mashpee in regards to something. And I tied the Recreation Commission, the Recreation Department, to why the town is great, because it is a lot of parents rely on that to be able to, you know, work and keep going here. So don't get overwhelmed. Just pick your thing, whatever your one thing is going to be. If you want it to be 2 things, great.
Yeah, and I mean, rec, libraries, schools, all of those have boards, committees that in most towns that are overseeing and making recommendations on the work that's done. And I think that, you know, when it comes to quality of life and how we interact with the town and, you know, people with families, it's a big deal. to have good programs in all those areas. And those are less political and often, you know, ones that are more accessible, I think. So if people are afraid of getting too political, then they can get into that. But planning boards and, you know, there's a lot of other stuff that finance committee, I mean, it all sounds intimidating, but I think, again, you want a fresh set of eyes on that. You want, you know, and they will teach you as you go. You don't have to be that expert going into it. So I think, you know, one of the things at CCYP that we're always looking at are the critical needs for young people to live and work here successfully. CCYP has a history starting back when Stephanie was on the board, you know, doing the Shaping the Cape study with Northeastern University, big scale study of, you know, what were those things that would pull and keep young people here versus what were the things that might push them to consider living somewhere else. And so we're always kind of monitoring and looking at those things. And there are a lot of challenges. I mean, it's no secret. I'm sure we've all experienced them to some degree or another. I know that we have. You know, personally, it's something I've talked about. I think that you don't have to look far to find young people who've been housing insecure, who've had trouble, you know, finding childcare, who have felt stuck in their job because there's not somewhere to go and advance to a next level. How has taking on an active role in advocacy changed your perspective, if at all? Has it changed your perspective on some of these challenges that we faced, you know, and have faced as young people living and working in this region? Start with Tamora.
I think I was very lucky. I found a job at a jewelry store years ago, like 12 years ago. We're closed down now because of COVID, but I was given an apprenticeship to become a goldsmith, and it is pretty cool. I get to play with fire. It's the best.
That's awesome.
And the pay was pretty good, which allowed me to stay here on Cape. So for a long time, it was hard for me to really see the challenges that most families face because I wasn't facing it personally. It wasn't affecting me personally. And then when, after my divorce and my kids, you know, went with their mom, things just kind of got a little crazy. And I was just like, oh, okay, my kids need food. Say what now? Okay. And after that, I was just like, oh, things are really hard on Cape. I didn't really see it because it wasn't actively affecting me at the time, you know? And the more I was at Four Cs, involved in different organizations, the more I just started to open my mind because I live in Dennisport. I've been here on Cape for like 13, 14 years, but I'm from Freeport, New York, on Long Island. And things weren't great there. But when I moved here, I assumed things would be better because how could it not? Look at it. It's gorgeous. How could things not be better? So after learning the challenges that my kids were going through, you know, they're fine now. Don't worry. They're all great. They're all grown. They're out of my house and don't ruin my kitchen anymore. But I saw things differently once my divorce happened, and I saw how difficult it was for my ex-wife and my kids. And that was just when I was just like, okay, I need to get involved more because I don't understand why this is happening to a mother with 3 kids. Why isn't the state, why isn't the community, why isn't Barnstable taking care of this family? So seeing that really opened my eyes to the services that are available and ones that aren't, depending on your tax bracket, which is a pain in my whole ass. Listen, guys, let's talk about that for a second. Just because I make enough money to live does not mean I make enough money to pay everything. It's so hard to live on Cape because it's so damn expensive. So freaking expensive. Things need to come down a little bit. let's all bring it down some, okay? Let's
And
bring
the
the prices
numbers, I mean, to qualify for support of any kind, it does hit at a pretty low level where
down.
you're,
Absolutely.
so if you're working full time, then it's difficult to qualify for any kind of help. So
Exactly. You can work full time and make enough money to pay your rent, but you can't eat.
right. And one of the best things that's come out of the COVID-19 situation, I would say, has been the opening up of that support network.
Yep.
You no longer have to qualify at certain levels to receive food for your kids. You know, you just get it because you live here and you're part of the school system, and everybody needs a little help every now and then, and we leave it up to the families to say when they need that help.
I hope that continues.
That's not the norm. So, yeah. What about you, Stephanie? What are you thinking in terms of just, I mean, has it changed your perspective at all being involved in advocacy?
Yeah, I mean, in lots of ways. I mean, so yeah, also Tamara, just also totally echoing everything that you said. And, you know, I think for me, you know, I've been advocating for just, you know, something as basic as making it, you know, as easy to build an in-law apartment, an accessory dwelling unit, as it is to put the same addition on your house that's a McMansion, you know, and running into resistance around that. And, you know, you can, you know, I think, Tamara, you hit the nail on the head. You can be part of a couple with two incomes and be okay, not great. I mean, it's getting harder and harder. But if you're single, you know, and with children, or just single, like it becomes a lot harder. Also because there's just not the type of inventory of housing that we need. Like there's not, 82% of our housing stock is single family homes. There's not enough 1 and 2 bedroom units that our workforce needs. And so we set up a situation where there's not, you know, I studied economics, you know, and was part of the Rotaract Club at 4Cs. And, you know, what I learned is like in a healthy economy, you have natural affordability at different places along, you know, the scale. And what we've done, you know, you can have something where if you're making, you know, $30,000 a year, you can find something that works for you. If you're making 50,000, 100,000, like there's something for each person. It's going to be, you know, maybe nicer the higher you get up. But what we've ended up doing through our zoning policies is we've ended up making it so that there's not natural affordability in the marketplace. And the only people who essentially can afford, because we have limited land, we're not going to, like, you know, turn this into, you know, Cambridge. We're not going to, you know, add land out into the ocean, you know, so with the limited land that we do have, the prices of everything's going up, so that only really, you know, wealthier retirees and second homeowners are the only people who can afford to buy here. And I think the disconnect is kind of, you know, going back to that idea of talking about your experiences. The people, for the most part, who tend to sit on planning boards, on boards of selectmen, they bought their homes 20, 30 years ago. You know, they haven't had to experience what it's like to be a renter or a buyer in this market. And so there's a massive disconnect. And then there's also this disconnect that, like, if you don't have the workforce here, then all the businesses, I mean, there's a story in the Cape Cod Times today about they don't have the J1 workers, they don't have the H2B workers that they need, you know, the year-round workers who have made up a lot of the workforce. A lot of them are leaving in droves. So what does that mean for people who remain? It means that the year-round businesses may not be able to stay in business. It means that they have to have reduced hours, or it means they have to, you know, import workers from over the bridge, which, you know, clogs traffic even more. You know, it adds, you know, the amount, if they have to house them, it adds to that cost, gets passed on to you and me as consumers. So part of the reason the Cape's so expensive is because employers are having to twist themselves into pretzels in order to find a way to have employees that can be here, serving us. And so, for me, I think a lot of it just starts with housing and addressing housing. And as I got into this, I was rather naive and I didn't know a lot of the history. I didn't know, why we had, multifamily and ADUs hundreds of years ago, and now why we don't. And then, I read about The Color of Law, a great book that gets into the history of zoning that was overtly racist in this country and in passing single family only zoning. And, we today live in a society that's the norm. And so we have no idea what the roots of it were, but we're still living with the repercussions of it. And it's harming Cape Codders today. And it makes up, what Cape Cod looks like. And for me, I guess in answer to your question, Lauren, how has it changed things? In some ways, it's made me more frustrated because, I see the Cape Cod that I grew up with, where there was natural affordability in the marketplace and where you could be a fisherman or in the trades and make a living for your family and live a good life and own a home. And I see that opportunity fading day by day by day. And the solution for me is not to disengage, and the solution is not to say no to affordable housing or to new development. It's to say yes to smart development.
Absolutely. Yeah. Awesome. I want to ask Noelle now. I mean, I think kind of what I'm struck by listening to you guys so far is this is almost a question of, advocacy. We think of us changing the world, but it also changes us. And as we're going through it, changes our perspective, changes how we see things, changes what we know to be true. And so what are your thoughts on that, Noelle? How has it changed your picture of what it means to be a young person living, working here?
It validated some experiences that I had first coming here. So I lived here for a year in 2004 and I left early because I could not, I was on a 1-year work permit, so I only had a year, but I was like, I'm so done with the Cape. I'm so ready to go back to Nassau. This place is not for me. And a lot of it was because I really felt like there was nobody here like me. My age, I'm an immigrant from a predominantly Black country, even though I'm not Black. I just felt very like, where are my people? And I felt like I just couldn't wait to go. And then my husband spent years working hard to convince me to move back up here. And my first thought was, well, where are we going to live and how are we going to do this? And he's been here his whole life, so he made it work. I have to say, a lot of it had to do with him, but we were also lucky that we bought our house after the recession. And now, if we were making what we were in 2010, which was, I had no salary because I had just immigrated here, so I was waiting on my green card. We were on just his salary at the time. There's no way I'd be able to buy my house now. Zero. And my house isn't even valued at what it was at its peak in 2005. And I will just give you a picture. I live in a Cape regular 3-bedroom, 2-bath house on a main road in Mashpee. I'm not living in, I don't know, gated area or anything like that. So I think I went through that. And then with working at the chamber and working in the Lower Cape, I started hearing these stories of what people were experiencing, young families, employees, whether they are J1 students who are here or, H-2B immigrant workers. And the more I learned, the more I was struck by what the level of disconnect in between the experience of the people who I knew that had lived here their whole life and that were a part of the haves, along with the people who, you know, were really struggling, and how hard it was for them to get by. I could not believe that somewhere that has as much money as the Cape, in a state like Massachusetts, from, you know, this was just my thought at the time. How are people living like this? I really felt like I'd left that behind in Nassau. I mean, I grew up in a place where I've seen people that live in shacks. I've seen people that beg on the side of the road constantly. I've seen people just, you know, like, you see them wearing dirty clothes, you know that's their clothes. Like, there's no extra for them. And so I really felt, and I still feel this way, that, you know, the Cape has enough resources where things can be spread around differently. And this is a whole thing for the entire country, not just Cape Cod, but, you know, this is where I focus on my backyard. And so that's what's changed my perspective over time, is that I see it getting, I see the voices getting louder of what the needs are. Definitely since when I started at the Chamber, but definitely since when I lived here in 2004 till now, for sure. So it's changed my perspective a lot. I just learned a lot more. So you have to be more empathetic and more compassionate. Even like seniors that are retired, that, you know, are barely making it on their Social Security payment. I mean, it's tough. There's a lot of people here who are struggling, and I did not know that before.
Yeah, it's very hidden, I feel like. And I think that young people in general are kind of a hidden population here, but we've seen that change with CCYP. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic that happens where it's, especially if you just visit for part of the year, you know, it's really hard to see what's below the surface. And I think that's pretty typical for a seasonal or tourist economy where there's a lot on under the surface that you don't see. But that's why it's important, like you said, for those voices to be getting louder and sharing what's going on. So I want to kind of wrap it up with some thoughts about, you know, what's next, and if you could say anything to people watching, particularly our young working age adult community, if they're thinking about, you know, oh, I've had experiences like these, this is resonating with me, I'm snapping along with you, and hearing what you're saying here, you know, what would you say to people who are thinking about dipping their toes into advocacy, or, you know, who want to see some changes happen? What would you say to them? We'll start with Tamora.
I would say I learned this, I made this acronym out of a lesson I learned from one of my mentors, Vanna Trudeau, and I call it Be Pacao. One, it's fun to say. Be Pacao. And it stands for be powerful, clear, assume goodwill, and hold people to account. Be Pacao, you know? And I feel like young people in their position right now that I couldn't have done at their age. Like, I'm just starting to like feel the advocacy legs, you know, starting to find my strut and stuff, you know, but these kids are out here like, listen, we're not doing this today, okay? We're gonna make change today. So I just wanna say to those kids, like, keep going, you know, keep getting involved in your community, keep talking to your friends, keep the pressure on social media, keep calling your representatives, keep the pressure on, and remember to be Pacao, okay? Be powerful, clear, assume goodwill, and hold people to account. So that's what I would say to the younger kids.
That's like a superpower. I saw your Batman mug, by the way, and this is like a superpower, right? Yeah, it's awesome. My favorite superhero. He's not really a superhero.
He is the greatest. Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Stephanie?
Yeah, so I'd say I think it's amazing. You know, it often is the young people who create the greatest change when you look back in history. I would say one of the important lessons, though, is that decisions are made in, planning board meetings. They are made in selectmen board meetings. They are made at town meeting. They are made in the halls of the State House, in the halls of Congress. And so it is not enough, collectivism is not, decisions aren't made on Facebook. And so it is really important, while we speak up and are vocal and, work to sort of, change hearts and minds through our conversations, that we are also then taking that to its next logical step, which is exactly what Tamara said, of making those phone calls to your elected officials, to showing up. And again, I would say you would be shocked at how influential, if you and even 3 of your friends just showing up at a selectmen's meeting or a town council meeting, speaking on the same issue, even if you don't have clear, concrete solutions, but you're saying, this is a problem and this cannot stand, and we need you to take a leadership role in this, how powerful that can be. And then continuing to engage, once is great, and again, it's 100% more if you haven't done anything, but keeping up the drum, so that because sometimes decisions are made when you're not looking. So if you can kind of keep looking and keep engaging and keep beating that drum in those public venues, we can really change things. But I would also say, the clock is ticking, at least for the survival of the Cape. We've seen this story before. We've seen, the billionaires crowd out the millionaires on the islands, and now that's happening on the Outer Cape, and now it's starting to creep up on the Mid Cape and the Lower Cape and the Upper Cape. So, we don't have a ton of time. We've got to engage now.
Great message. And Noelle, wrap us up here. What are your thoughts?
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think there's a ton of energy, especially in this particular moment. We just finished up a week where there were a lot of protests all around the Cape and the country for racial equality. There were a lot of young people that organized those events, that were right up at front and center at those events. So whether it's racial equality or housing or anything, you can't just complain about it online. That's not going to change anything. Nobody's going to care what you post up on Facebook trying to educate your friends. I know that helps a little bit. I get it. But that's not really going to make the change. And at the end of the day, you have to put yourself out there publicly, whether it's you can write a letter to the editor. There are state rep offices to track what happens in the newspapers. And it doesn't have to be in the Times. You can write it into your local neighborhood newspaper. They get them all and they read them all. You can call their office. Calling is great. They track phone calls a lot. They track phone calls a lot more than email. So even though they do track the emails, phone calls mean a lot more. So if there's something that you and your friends see and you're really passionate about it, call your state reps. If you don't know who they are, you can look them up online and find out who they are pretty quickly. If you want to be involved with the CCYP Public Policy Committee, there is a space for you. You don't have to be an expert. I certainly was not when I first started, but we lean on people to get expert advice from them. And same thing for us with the local chambers. We lean on other business resources to be able to provide guidance. So that's grateful. We're grateful for that. And there are many organizations that are providing support. So whether if you want to be involved for racial equality, seek out Tamora, seek out the NAACP, seek out your local ACLU chapter. You do not have to be alone. And these places will help guide you on how to make the change happen. Don't just sit behind a screen complaining. That's not changing anything.
Awesome. Yes. Tamora's going, yes. Yeah. Definitely. I think there's something to be said for you're not going to be out there alone. many cases, there are efforts already underway that need your help and support. And so you don't have to be that expert. You don't have to be that lone person going out there and trying to make that change by yourself. CCYP is a great example of, we collect data, we do surveys, need surveys, and we need people to share those. We need people on the public policy committee to help us, draft the questions and figure out what our research questions are going to be. What do we need to know in order to do our work effectively? And then we need bodies. We need people to get out there and, spread the word and speak from their experiences. And I think that'll.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that, and I don't want this to get lost in the conversation. So I was born in '82, so I'm technically an old millennial. And I am so impressed with our high school students and our college students with the level that they do want to get involved, and they feel passionately about all the different causes, whether it's climate change or, all the things we've discussed today. And that they do vocally say something, because I will tell you, I do not feel like when I was in college, people my age were doing that. We were not. So I'm impressed immensely with their level of engagement. And that's why I'm trying to direct the energy in the way where it will help to make things actually happen, so that they don't feel let down and like they're not being heard. Because trust me, I know I hear you loud and clear, and I'm sure that there are many others that do as well. So don't let those words just be said. Have them mean something.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference just to show up. And I think that's something that you don't hear recognition of often enough, but the students and the young people that are doing the work that they're doing right now to organize peaceful marches, and even if it's showing up and participating in town meeting, I mean, that deserves all of it, from one end of the spectrum to the other, needs to be recognized and acknowledged as just important. It's really needed, and it's seen, definitely. I agree with you there.
Yeah, I saw, I was so impressed that there's a petition going around for Barnstable High School students and alum, started by, I think, existing students or ones who are just now graduating, talking very specifically about, like, okay, this is how we want to make sure that the curriculum is changed to, better reflect, lives of people of color and histories, and changes to, the Red Raiders name, and like very specific changes and really in depth. And I was so impressed to see that, because that's, being submitted to, I believe, the school committee. So like that's a perfect example of like taking that concern, turning that into like specific kind of policy, incorporating the organizing aspect, and then bringing it up to decision makers. I mean, that's kind of the full picture of what advocacy looks like.
And that, I would argue, is one of the sort of more complex ends of the spectrum, because as you mentioned earlier, Steph, you don't even have to have all the answers or the recommendations or the suggestions of how to improve. You just have to say, hey, is anybody paying attention over here? When I saw this thing, this isn't really lining up for me, and here's why. All you have to do sometimes is just point it out and speak up, and not be afraid to do that. And whenever I'm talking to someone and they say, well, I don't really, who am I? Why should I be talking? Other people know more than I do. I mean, that again, that intimidation factor is huge. It prevents people from doing things, but the decisions, as you said, get made one way or the other. And you're going to say something and have your perspective be considered, or are you going to stay quiet and leave it up to someone else that may or may not know more than you? They may not know more than you. In many cases, they may just be the one that's willing to say something.
Or be afraid and do it anyway. I'm usually afraid anytime that I speak up. I just hide it well.
Yeah. Your voice may shake, but speak up anyway. Another one. Right. So, yeah. All right. Any last minute thoughts? This has been awesome. You ladies are a bunch of powerhouses. We're so lucky to have you on the Cape doing what you do.
We're lucky to have you, Lauren, too. You're a great executive director for CCYP.
Thanks, Noelle.
Well, president and CEO. You've done a great job. That's my thought.
Same. I haven't been to CCYP, but I've been in a lot of Zoom meetings, and this was done very well.
Well, I hope those watching get a lot out of it. Stephanie, last minute, I mean, resources would be another thing we can direct people to. There's tons of them.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, like the work that you all are doing at CCYP, compiling information is really helpful. You know, I started a Facebook group last year kind of as an experiment called Year Round Cape Cod. You know, I encourage anyone who wants to, who lives here year round, to join it. Just have to agree to the rules. And, you know, that's a place where we post information about things that are happening in the community, understanding that not everybody is going to those websites and looking for those things proactively. So trying to get that information out ahead of time, you know, and I've got a few blogs, you know, on my website that just go into, like, if you are going to speak, kind of, you know, how to formulate that elevator speech, that type of thing. That's on nexusworks.com. But I would say, you know, I'm sorry?
Yeah. We can share links too if you guys want anything my way.
I just say, you know, CCYP, you know, just also as a community, you know, for me moving back here, you know, I wasn't necessarily connecting with my high school friends, but I found a whole group of people that, you know, were of like mind and trying to make a life here. And, you know, that helped me feel less alone. You know, I think your willingness to engage is to some degree proportional to how alone you feel. And so those connections are really critical, and CCYP really fosters those connections in a way that I've never seen before.
Yeah, and I think you know, there's a lot of misunderstandings about what the organization is, and I think, you know, for those that are, you know, maybe not as familiar with it, you definitely get a sense of we're stronger the more of us are in this. You know, like the more people, the more experiences, perspectives, you know, whether you go here or, you know, are a watch the store, whether you know, are working in one industry or another, what your racial and ethnic background might be, it's stronger when we have more of, you know, all of it. And so I think that just is such a huge deal, and it does make change. It does improve the community in the long term, I think, especially when we have people like all of you speaking up for what we know is going to make that happen. So, well, thank you again. I really appreciate all three of you taking the time to have this conversation today. Again, want to thank our sponsor, Cape and Islands Association of Realtors, for making this possible. And we will be posting the link to the full conversation on our YouTube channel and up on social media. Stay tuned, and we'll share some resources as well as we get those. So thanks everybody. Get out, vote, get involved, volunteer, whatever you can do. Make sure your voice is heard and that you're part of making this the best place that it can possibly be. So thanks, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.